Cup, causing problems for players and fans. Well, I've been speaking about all of this with Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor at the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, we've seen record high temperatures in several European countries, and indeed even here in the US. Last week we had Alaska with its first ever heat advisory. Can we attribute this stretch of heat waves to climate change?
To be blunt, yes. We wouldn't be seeing heat waves of this intensity this early in the summer. It's just barely into summer at this point, if it were not for the fact that we are warming up the planet with carbon pollution from the burning of fossil fuels, elevating global temperatures and making these sorts of heat waves more frequent and more intense.
And on that note, should we expect then that these sorts of temperatures will become the norm? There was that report from the European Copernicus program last week showing the world is getting hotter faster.
Yeah, I mean, the world is actually getting hotter at sort of a steady pace, but that's bad enough. It will continue to get warmer as we continue to add carbon pollution to the atmosphere. Until we bring those emissions to zero, the planet will continue to get warmer. And obviously, you know, it's not rocket science. You make the planet hotter, you're going to have more frequent and intense heat waves. But there's another ingredient here, which is that the pattern of warming, in particular, the fact that the polar regions are warming up so much faster, is actually changing the jet stream. And it's changing the jet stream in a way that gives you those very wiggly jet stream patterns that you see on a weather map with big high pressure and low pressure systems that remain in place for days on end. That's when you get these very persistent summer weather extremes, the heat domes, for example, that we've seen in North America and Europe. And that fact is something that isn't entirely captured by our climate models. Those models are potentially underestimating the extent to which we are changing the climate in a way that favors these very persistent summer weather extremes, these damaging and dangerous and even deadly weather extremes.
And do those heat domes now stay around for longer than they would have in the past?
Yeah, so one of the things we're seeing is that you're more likely to get these sort of stagnant systems. Heat dome is a high pressure center. It's associated with sort of the up wiggle in the jet stream. A low pressure center typically gives you rainfall, flooding with a very deep low pressure center. That's sort of the down part of the wiggle. And those wiggles are tending to stay in place for longer periods of time, so that high pressure, the heat, the drought, the wildfires stay over the same location for days upon days, or those low pressure systems with their rainfall stay stuck in the same location, and you get flooding rains day after day, giving you far worse flooding. And so that is something that we are seeing more of, and we do think it's linked, again, to human-caused warming.
And when you talk about the jet stream changing there, and we've seen other issues in Europe, lower levels on waterways, invasive species spotted in bodies of water where they wouldn't have been before, is that kind of environmental change reversible with the measures that are in place and underway?
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of good news there, which is that this particular phenomenon I'm talking about, how the pattern of warming of the surface creates sort of conditions where the jet stream is likely to get locked in place like that. We get those stagnant weather extremes. That's tied to the warming of the surface of the planet. So if we stop carbon emissions, if we stop warming up the surface of the planet, that will stabilize. That won't continue to get worse. Now, some of the impacts will stay with us for decades, potentially. The melting of the ice, the rise in sea level. We are committed to potentially many additional decades of continued climate change when it comes to some of those slower components of the climate system. But this particular pattern, this atmospheric pattern, it will not get any worse if we stop warming the surface of the planet. And that gives us agency. That tells us if we can bring those carbon emissions to zero and we stop warming up the surface of the planet, we will stop the exacerbation of these conditions that give us these very persistent summer weather extremes.